Welcome to another episode of Teachers and Dragons. My name is Brandon.
And I'm Bob. Teachers and Dragons is a group designed and facilitated by educators who, using best practices, help provide ways that all teachers can introduce tabletop RPGs into their curriculum in meaningful and insightful ways.
Today we'll be doing Teachers of the Roundtable, talking with two other teachers who also use gaming in the classroom. Please welcome Don and AJ.
Welcome, guys.
Hey.
So you all using RPGs in the classroom. Don, what do you teach?
So I teach sort of an integrated STEM course. I do one course right now I have is mechanical engineering, and then I also teach AP computer science principles.
And I teach junior kindergarten, so like 4 and 5-year-olds, which might seem a little bit young for RPGs, but they've actually taken to it whenever I've implemented it in class. And I also run the after-school Dungeons and Dragons for our middle school and high school groups. So there's a lot of kind of like social interaction chances there as well to kind of like use the game to expand on some things that sometimes their kids are working out, socially and emotionally.
So we've Bob and I've talked about our origin stories, but let's hear your origin story of how you all got into D&D.
Yeah, when did it start? When did you go down the rabbit hole?
Want to go first,
man.
Don?
Sure. So for me, it was I had some great buddies that I was playing World of Warcraft with in college. So that was like 2005 maybe. And a buddy of mine was like, "Oh man, if you like WoW, you probably really enjoy like D&D." And I was like, "No man, that's the real nerd stuff, right? Like I just play video games, but that's the deep part." But he had organized a huge thing. We probably had, I don't know, 25 people first show up to like this first D&D meeting. So we split up into little groups, and it ended up being me and just a few other guys. And I had a blast. We put together another group the next year in our dorm. And I had like this core group. I played as a bard, which has always been one of my favorite classes since then. And that was probably like my first like really long game as well. We played that whole year. And so since then, I just really have a love for the sitting down together, group storytelling part of tabletop gaming.
For me, it was also college. And my sophomore year, I ended up in a suite with three other dudes, and both my roommate and my two suite mates across the hall all played Dungeons and Dragons, and I'd never played before. And I remember distinctly, it was one night I came in from work, and they said, "Hey, we're going to play Dungeons and Dragons, and you're rolling up a character." And I said, "Nah." I was kind of like Don. I think I was like, "I feel like this is a terrible step forward in my in my nerd degree."
And it might make me evil.
Right. And if I can avoid that, then I can at least lie to myself and say that I'm not that degree of a nerd. And they said, "No, you're rolling up a character. It's like it's happening right now." And I was like, "Okay, I guess this is happening." And I was a little bit skeptical at first, and then I realized within like 15 minutes of us sitting down and like me like looking at the character sheets and like the different classes and all of the crazy cool things that you could do with it, my mind just started wheeling out into the ether, and I was like, this is going to be a problem. And I really haven't looked back since. I enjoy playing characters. I love DMing. I love running games for my friends and the kids at school. And it's just been one of those things where, like, whenever there's like new content that comes out, I've just been very excited to kind of absorb that as much as possible.
Nice. So since Don mentioned that he really likes playing a bard, do you have a favorite character type to play?
That's directed at me?
Yeah, Andrew. Yeah.
Boy.
I'm a tank man. I'm a big tank man.
I do tend to gravitate towards melee specialists and people who get kind of stuck in the mix. And I've realized that I tend to gravitate towards that because their mechanics are usually a little bit simpler, which really lends me towards being able to focus on how I play the character. And when I play spellcasters, a lot of times I have a very like scoped out, like what is the battlefield tactical approach to this battle, and I tend to kind of lose my character a little bit. Mm-hmm. And the best mesh for that for me for playing a spellcaster is usually playing a spellcaster that their personality gravitates towards that, where they like to be a little bit distant and also like make sure that they have good battlefield awareness. But that's why I also like to tend to play towards that, like an archetype, like a melee archetype, because I like to be able to like really get into who that character is and mesh them to the story.
That's a good transition because obviously we're talking mostly about groups and schools. What are the tricks that you and Don both use? Any strategies, any techniques, any suggestions for someone starting out to help your students find character?
I do a few things, I guess. Like some high school students, I think when they come in, like they're like, "Oh yeah, I'm playing D&D," and kind of like how I was at first, like I don't want to dive all the way in. I don't want to be like, am I prepared to be this kind of like this kind of silly with other people that I don't necessarily know? And so what I tell a lot of them to do at first is to just pick a character that you really like from something. For my first group, a lot of that like they stuck to those old school Tolkien characters. Like somebody was a Legolas, somebody was an Aragorn, and then I think for them, as they saw that I was doing that and I was going to make voices and I was going to be out there with it, that then they could build on that as well.
And Andrew, any things that you've done? Because that can be tricky, at least at first in my experience, is establishing that comfort to where they're like, yeah, I can be this.
Yeah, I think Don spoke on it really well as far as like just creating that safe place where the players understand that they can kind of be as into it or a little bit more approach it a little bit more cautiously as they see fit. And I tend to find that people that play at the table with me, especially when I'm running the game, they tend to feel more comfortable as we go on, and it's just one of those things that, like, people get to understand the other people at the table, and from seasoned vets to like newer players, there is still that initial like, okay, like who are people, who are these people, how am I going to mesh with them? I really like the idea of like being able to give like archetype examples of like, oh, here are characters from stories or movies or shows. Like if that's kind of what you're feeling, start with that, and then kind of helping the players work into their character as far as okay, well, so you want to play a character that is like kind of the lone gunslinger, like the Mandalorian, let's say, but you want them to have more of a kind of a sort of a more outgoing personality, more like I don't know, like a well, to follow the space marshal, cowboy kind of theme, like more like a Nathan Fillion-esque, character. So like, I'm like, you can blend those two things together. And if those are things that you really like, then there's absolutely room to find, that space to bring those characters to life. But, it starts with, making them comfortable at the table and making them aware that this is a safe space to act out as big, as largely or as quietly as they want to.
One thing that we've talked about before was when I start characters, and I teach middle school, and is mostly simplifying the character sheets. Don't even worry about the character sheets at first. We're not picking class. We're not picking race. You just kind of start as you, and then they start kind of filling in the character sheet as they go, and they will automatically seep into those kind of characters themselves. So they could enter a room and there's a whole list of weapons on the wall, and they pick the weapon from there, so you can kind of get an idea of what class they're going on, and then after that session you can start filling out that part of the character sheet. So we play the game, then we fill out our character sheet a little bit, which really helps.
Yeah, I think there's a big difference, right, in a group of adults, for example, who have always wanted to try D&D, and they're ready to dive in. I want to pick my race. I want to pick my weapon. Versus a kid that you're kind of asking them, at least initially, like, hey, give this a chance. Because I think the adult is ready to be like, okay, I'm going to be a half elf that is from this specific region. I mean, like the whole thing. Whereas a kid's like, I want to smash something.
Yeah. I think one thing that we unfortunately do in education is we suck the creativity part out of the student, and not actually meaning to, but there's so many times that we have opportunities for students to be creative, but we put it in this box, and then they can't really get outside of the box, so that they have a hard time thinking, I think, a lot of times, of something that can be their own, and they want to find all these parameters to fit it in. But just thinking of their own character and building something unique is sometimes pretty difficult. And I started playing D&D when I was right out of college. So I'd practiced not using my imagination for so long. And it's a skill. You have to practice using your imagination. And that's one thing that we unfortunately don't do enough of in early school.
Yeah. So, I mean, on that note, and we'll talk about the specific kind of school groups you run, but Andrew, I know that when the world of education went online, and I guess the whole world too, I know that you did this really inventive RPG that you had designed for a junior kindergarten class. So we're talking maybe some of them are 5 by then.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you would maybe talk a little bit about that, because I just remember that last day, and Andrew and I worked together, that last day of seeing you putting this together, that we were in the building. And I was just blown away by the creativity of it. So I wonder if you would talk a little bit about that and how that worked, and the successes or redos that you might do for the next round.
Sure. And so I love video games. I love games in general, but like my true love is stories. And that's really drew me to D&D at the outset. But for the kind of the remote learning and how I wanted to try and to make that something more than just worksheets at home, more than just like reading on your own home assignments. I really wanted to do something that I thought I could keep a high level of passion for, and so of course I drew in some of my D&D stuff, and to the I guess to kind of buffer expectations when you say that you create a game or something for someone, like you might start to like imagine a lot of polish, and I feel like I did a pretty good job for the short amount of time that we had to prepare. But like this was a lot of things crammed into a very short period of time before we all rolled over into remote learning last year. And but the premise was each of the students was given a set of templates of kind of like character archetypes. Then I chose very simple archetypes as far as like a strong character, a fast character, a smart character, I think, and the fourth one was like a charismatic character. In each of those play to some of the main attributes, stylings of your D&D character types. And I wanted to give them that choice because well, one of the things about role-playing games is choice, and I knew that each of my students had something that would help them connect to those characters better. The kid that can't ever sit still is going to pick the fast character. The kid who likes to kind of observe everybody probably will pick the smart character. But again, I wanted to give them that choice, because maybe that kid who usually looks and observes was like, you know what, I want to play the strong character this time. I just want to see what that's like. And so giving those basic archetypes gave them something to kind of latch on to. And then I also drew a bunch of different character art with like basically the bodies were a little bit, and again, like 4 and 5 year olds, it helps. The bodies were very like asexual, but like you had like kind of like different trappings of adventure archetypes. Like one had like long robes like a caster might, another one had like more kind of like scouting gear, one was wearing like heavy armor, and those bodies could be interswapped with the different heads that were available, so they got to choose like the features of the character that they wanted, that they felt most represented either them or who they wanted to be, and then match that to the body type, or like I guess like the class, body class, that they felt matched their character. And so again, it was that element of choice that they really spoke to, that I think really spoke to them. And then all of that was I guess, given an educational aspect by each week I would present new quests using we use Google Classrooms at our school, and each week I gave them a new quest using the Google forums to create basically like a choose your own adventure system where they got to like look at different quests and see which ones their character wanted to go on, and based on what they chose, they would have different assignments. And those assignments were, again, very Dungeons and Dragons themed, where it's like you meet an old man in the road. His cart has been is broken down. He has lost because I love Avatar, he's lost all of his cabbages and and wants to make sure that he has all of them. Can you help him count his cabbages? Or there's an old man in the road. He has his cart horse has lost a shoe, and is panicky. Can you help calm the horse with your kind of ability to be charismatic and like a calming effect on people around you? And that was more of a kind of like a social emotional exercise. And so again, and I would encourage the students to do more than one assignment and submit their work. And their parents were really good about submitting examples of like them doing their work. And it's difficult to, I guess, as far as like the shortcomings and the successes, it's difficult to really get parents to buy into something when you're kind of ambushing them halfway surprise through the year. If they came into remote learning with the expectation of kind of like what it's going to look like, I think it would have been easier to make that transition. But overall, considering that everyone was kind of figuring things out as they went, I think it worked pretty well. And I think it struck a chord with both the parents who really had to help facilitate with my younger students, as well as with the students themselves.
Yeah.
Was there any pushback on that from parents or even administrators?
Well, I'll say no, and I'll say no with a caveat. Admin, because I'll admit I was super stoked. I was super excited about the idea of everything that I had just made, and I was like, man, I really hope it works well. And I was showing it off to everybody because I was just really proud of what went into it. And also, like, I mean, like, if that inspired anybody else to be like, hey, maybe I could use something like that in my own stuff. Cool. And so admin wise, like, I got like the green lights, and they were pretty thrilled that I was going into remote learning with as much, fervor as I did. So no pushback there. And parents were really on board, but I think at some point, I had to adjust for different parents in different families because some of them were like, hey, my kids, blasting through the stuff that you've set up for them. Can you give us some more? I was like, yeah, I can give you some supplemental stuff. And a couple of them were like, this is a very busy time for us right now. Like we're having a tough time, sitting down with the lessons that you've created. Like stuff might be a little bit late. And I was like, okay, look, I totally understand. I'm not grading you, the parents, to get work in on time. This is just guidelines to try and make sure that your children and your students are getting value as we go on into our remote learning. So I think the big thing was just feedback was super important, and making sure that everyone was on the same page.
Now, Don, kind of coming up to middle school, you run it after school or do you run it in school? What do you do?
So my mine's all after school, except for kind of how I bring things into the classroom. So I guess I can just talk about that. So what I always tried to, or at least what I've tried to do really at the beginning, most of my students that were coming to D&D were also my students in class. So sometimes we were running some things. I would kind of purposefully present them with a problem that they had to kind of do that engineering mindset that we have been talking about. Or like, I can think of a couple of times where it's like they'd be in a room and this door is stuck and there's items that they could use as levers. And they really got to, like, which thing would be the best lever based on, like this and this. And so I would do that. And then on the other side as well, since I do like some computer-aided design sort of stuff, like kids have made their own dice towers and we 3D print those, or like
love that.
It becomes a thing then that they're like, how do you make a 20-sided die in CAD, which is really hard, actually. You really have to think about some geometry when you sit down to do it, or else you're going to sit there and, try to carve each side into this thing and it looks lopsided. So yeah, I do a little bit of both, but mostly after school when we play.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a STEM guy. I'm a jazz guy. I didn't think for a second about like the implications there of like using CAD. I think that's awesome. And then when I'm trying to sort it out in my head, and I was like, yeah, I bet that is hard.
Yeah. So it's interesting because like I think lots of people when they play D&D are storytellers, and I really enjoy the story as well. But I think coming from the engineering mindset, like when I started teaching this, is also when I really took off with D&D. I really got and kind of fell in love with the numbers, and I became like that sort of person playing as well. So a lot of my students, almost any student that I've had that's been in computer science, that's also been a D&D club, ends up making some sort of character creator for one of their applications that they have to make in my class.
That's awesome.
And so, they do this where like it's going to do the random numbers and it's going to roll this, it's going to give you your bonuses, it's going to do all these little things. And so I think I probably still have a couple of kids, like if they've made them in this certain program, I can come back and look at those. But it's always so much fun to me because then I think they get that understanding as well, right? Like by senior year, so many of them are like, oh, so I have this percentage chance to hit based on all these numbers that I've done at that point. Because I always kind of like when they're going to do something that's dumb, like I try not to like, tell them, but I'm like, is that something you really want to do? Which kids...
Yes, I do.
Kids being kids, say that to each other, like, do you really want to do that? And then they like crunch some numbers and they kind of talk about stuff that way. So it's that I think being able to teach math, which like wasn't necessarily my initial background, I think getting kids to at least enjoy that part and then see kind of how random numbers and algorithms work inside of games has been one of my favorite things to really see blossom from them during this time.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder if in the origins of D&D and any number of tabletop games, if that forward thinking was part of the plan, or if it just kind of lined up. It really does give you an appreciation for the work of any games creator, just to establish that system.
So I read. It's like a graphic novel of a read, so it's really short. But it's the story of Gary Gygax, and now I can't think of the other person who like came together to make D&D. But it's really interesting because like one of them was really into the story part, and the other one's really into like the math, the war game sort of thing. And those two things blending together, I think, is what makes D&D so special, especially with kids.
Yeah, and that's a good transition into. Because you already kind of hinted at it, Don, but for everybody, and Brandon and I, this is something we've talked about pretty much every time we've recorded, but what are some positive changes that you've seen in your groups? The kid when they start versus when they graduate or they move on. What are some of the positives?
I'm going to hop in here. I think compositionally over the past few years, the makeup of the D&D groups has changed. When I first started offering Dungeons and Dragons to the middle school, it was all boys. And the school that Bob and I teach at is known for its drama production. And it's one of those things where I was always like I feel like Dungeons and Dragons is one of those things that is way more accessible to more people than a lot of people realize. Mm-hmm. But it can be daunting to get into. There is still a stigma, which seems to be, I think, WotC, Wizard of the Coast, they've been doing a good job of like rebranding themselves as something that is, not strictly just for nerds.
Even their new cover art is much more diverse and inclusive than ever has been.
Oh, yeah.
And also just I think it's more public, it's more in the public mindset of like, hey, this is a cool thing that can be done. But I think people are just really looking for like a good social game, some sort of activity. And this is like, it's kind of, really, really well refined at this point as far as like being a good social game. But all of that to say, back to the composition of who I'm seeing at the table. And at first, it was all boys, and they did great. And I was very impressed, actually, with just how involved they were. And they would come to me with like new ideas for the characters, and they'd ask me like, Mr. Frechette, if I crunch these numbers these ways, can will this work? And I'm like, yeah, I think it will, and I think that's a really cool idea that you have your character. Or they're like, if I make a grappling hook and tie it to that that monster foot that we got last campaign, can I turn that into some sort of like weird monster foot grappling gun? And I'm like, I'm just excited that you're like putting this stuff together, so I'm willing to let you give it a try. And they were super invested, but again, the composition at the table was almost exclusively white boys. And as we have gone on through the years, actually just this year, the composition of the table of the players is mostly girls, with some boys added in. And I just think that's awesome, because that's, again, just people feeling comfortable trying things out, and again breaking some of those old stereotypes of like rolling dice and making character sheets, that's for guys and guys only. And kind of fiercely defending their place at the table are some of these girls that are playing at the table. And I will also say, not to get into too many specifics, but I have a couple of players who don't fit into standard gender roles, and as the characters they play, as well as how they ascribe to themselves personally. And I think that's really cool, and it's been a challenge for me as a game master to work on my pronouns, and that has been a big thing for me to be like to honor, and so that has been but it's a very important thing to me, because I think if someone is willing to come to the table and really own a role, and if they are being an even truer version of themselves, then you have to bring your A game as far as like respect, as well as like the effort that you put in, that they are being so brave with who they are willing to show you at the table.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And and I'm seeing that too, not with my group at school, but a group that I run with, some new friends that I've made, during the pandemic, almost entirely female, just people that wanted to give this a try. And I don't know, maybe they came from an environment where they thought it wasn't for them, but I do think that is changing, and it's great to see. Don, any cool or positive changes that you've seen, either in your group's composition or even just individual kids?
I would say one of my favorite things about doing D&D at my school is there's not in the past, there just hasn't been a lot of clubs and groups that were outside of sports. I work at a school where we've just got a rotating cast of teachers, and so a lot of stuff, like we've had an anime club in the past, and then that teacher leaves, and so that program leaves with them. So I think my longevity there, and what this group is, it's been really nice to have some kids who might not have had something to latch onto, and they might not have known that this person was also interested in D&D and some other things. And so really just seeing some friendships develop in an after-school thing, and having kids really develop a sense of belonging to our school, I think is really where it is. That's been really one of the biggest positives, because I had that same kind of experience in high school. Like, I was not an athletic kid. I was kind of goofy. I joined this art club, and even though I wasn't particularly artistic, it was really great for me. And so for some kids, it was just having somewhere to go after school and be with some friends and kind of like talk about the day, I think has really had the biggest impact.
Yeah, and I think that's something that doesn't quite get enough mention, is a place where you feel safe and where you belong. For me in high school, if I didn't have band, then I don't know where I would have fit in.
Yeah, that's exact same for me. Like, band was my outlet, and unfortunately, we didn't have any D&D stuff because it was evil back then. But
yeah, and I'm from the South, so like it was extra evil.
Yeah,
right.
Oh yeah, yeah. So, go ahead.
No, you're fine. Go ahead.
Which is, I think, is it's been great as well as it's like my first principal that I told I was going to do D&D. He was just like, anything you can get to get kids involved is great. But my second one, he was a little older and a little more like old school, and he was just like, I don't know what that is, Mr. Bacon, but if kids are enjoying it, you go ahead. But my most recent principal has been playing in a D&D game with the same people for the past 10 years, and so he's
That
like,
is awesome.
so he's like, hey, if I can come up and play, if I get some free time, you just let me know. I'm like, you are
That's
always
awesome.
welcome. Yeah.
One thing we'll end on here is what is one tip, one piece of advice, one tool, anything that you have to give to someone new trying to think about putting D&D into school or incorporating it. And we'll start with Bob.
Yeah, so my biggest advice is, and we've talked about it before in other episodes, but jump on in, right? I mean, you can't ruin it. You can't break it. So jump in. I would encourage everyone to pull from the pop culture that you're most familiar with. If you love high fantasy movies, pull some of that setting in and start creating that world. Or if you love the space opera, like we were talking about a little earlier, you can set things wherever you want. So jump on in, start telling a story. And, the other tip I would just give to anyone that's brand new and running a game is you don't need to be word perfect in the rule book. Just be consistent.
I'd say for my biggest tip is going off what Bob is saying, definitely jump in, but pacing, make sure it's students are not getting bored, watch, read the room. And if it starts getting slow, have something to move it forward. I actually use a tiny sand timer, and it's perfect because if we're in combat or something and a student is notorious for taking too long, it's like, you got to think you're in the moment of combat and here it goes. Mm-hmm. So definitely work on pacing.
And we're all teachers here, and most of you watching this, your educators have experience with that. We know how to read a room. So let those teacher skills help you out.
Yeah. I would say yes. I think I had an idea of what a D&D game was supposed to be like because I had played with adults for a long period of time, and the stuff kids were coming up with that they wanted to do, I was like, what are you talking about? You can't do that. You can't do. And I was like, why am I doing that? I want you to have this creative space to be able to jump in and be yourself to a certain degree, but even be an extension of yourself. Mm-hmm. And so, there's no reason for me to say no. If you've got this creative idea, go for it. We'll roll the dice, and if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. And if you roll a 20, we'll roll from there. I would say let the game flow a little bit and really let all of the kids get into it.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, I think that saying yes is a strong point there, where if you create a good atmosphere at the table, and I think if you have if you have solid classroom management skills in general, I've said for the longest time that Dungeons and Dragons and teaching have so many parallels. It's kind of ridiculous. But if you have that ability to kind of generate that safe place, then the students and the players will be able to look at that, and they will be able to succeed spectacularly, or succeed heroically and fail spectacularly, and it's all going to be fun. Because that is the joy of having the randomness, the joy of really owning your character and being part of that story, and listening to the students and seeing what really those really important things in their characters that you can kind of pull in and add to the story, kind of drop as little landmarkers, and they're like, hey, he talked about that thing that my character thinks is important, and that will just explode that world for them, and just really giving them chances to connect to that world, and not just to the world, but there are groups that I've played with that are that they'll just RP at the table, and I just kind of lean back a little bit and I just kind of cross my arms and I'm just cool,
Look at what I have created.
yeah, riff on that for a bit, and I'll add in a little bit like, oh, character comes in, drops some food off at the table, and just like kind of step back out of the picture for a bit, and I think the end goal is like and this is for DMs in general, but also very specifically for when you're working with younger players, I think, is that like don't let your narrative get in the way of a good story.
Yes.
I love that.
And sometimes, it's just stepping back and letting the characters have fun. That's the most important thing.
Very cool. Well, thank you all so much for joining us, Don and AJ. It's been great talking to you all. Look forward to having you all back again.
Fantastic. It was great being here.
Yeah.
All right, guys. You all have a great day.
Take care.
All right.
So.